Hi, Modern World History students. We're rapidly coming to the close of Unit 8, the Second World War, and we're going to continue section number 14, Allied Offensives on the Mediterranean and Western Fronts of the European Theater. And in our last lesson, we got through what was called Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Remember that at that time, Germany occupied France. They had occupied France since the spring of 1940. And the Allies, the Western Allies, the United States, Britain, and Canada, landed soldiers on the beaches of Normandy to begin the process of driving the Germans out of France and back into Germany, and really bringing a close to the war in Europe. Remember that the Soviets, meanwhile, were already moving in from the east. They were moving in on the Germans from the east. And so now the Allies were going to start moving in from the west. And this would bring an end to the war. But there was still more fighting to be done. And so we'll continue that story before we switch over to section 15 and talk about Allied offensives in the Pacific. So the landing of soldiers on the beaches of Normandy was a very difficult operation and costly. 5,000 Allied soldiers had been killed in just that one day's landing. But the reality is that it was really just the beginning of the difficult fighting. And the reason why, as we move to the top of page 21, was that the territory of northern France was agricultural land. It was farming country, some of the very nicest farming country in Western Europe. And so as Allied troops began to land, began to fill in the beaches of Normandy. Now you have to understand that the first day of the invasion of Normandy, only about 200,000 soldiers arrived. But now over the next 6 weeks, an additional 1.5 million soldiers were going to come through Normandy and be sort of poured into the attack against the Germans in France. So 1.5 million more soldiers. And you can see that in some cases they were able to land directly on the beaches at Normandy. But look how crowded that whole area is with ships. It goes to show you what it took to undertake this invasion of German-occupied Western Europe. A whole area there crowded with ships. They also created an artificial harbor, a man-made harbor. And remember, this was part of the deception of landing at Normandy. The Germans didn't think that the landing would happen at Normandy because there was no harbor there. There was no port for ships to come in. The Germans knew that in the long run, the force that actually landed on the day of the invasion was going to be just the beginning, and that the Allies would have to bring in 1.5 million more soldiers, all of their equipment, tanks, trucks, artillery. And so the Germans had expected that the invasion would happen where there was a port. But the Allies actually built an artificial port, an artificial harbor, 2 of them actually, off the beaches of Normandy that allowed big cargo ships to come in and land and start offloading the really heavy equipment, like the tanks and the artillery. But again, over the next 6 weeks, 1.5 million men, tanks, trucks, artillery, all their supplies began to pour through the beaches of Normandy. And here are some of those artificial harbors that you can see constructed here off the coast of the beaches. You can today in areas see the remains of these artificial harbors. You can see some of them left over. But as I mentioned, this was farm country. And so actually fighting through the farm country of northern France proved to be just as difficult, in fact, arguably even more difficult than landing on the beaches, because this had been farm country for hundreds of years. And the way that French farmers divided up their fields, prior to the availability of cheap fencing, like barbed wire fencing and things like that, like we used out in the American West, the way that they divided up their fields was by planting what were called hedgerows. And you can see these hedgerows that are used to divide up the fields. And the thing is that these hedgerows form these sort of long mounds. And those mounds provided sort of ready-made cover or ready-made defense for the German soldiers who were now defending northern France against the Allied soldiers that were pouring in through Normandy. And kind of like what we talked about down here in Italy, where the geography of the ridges and the valleys really helped the Germans who were defending Italy against the Allied soldiers. The Germans would dig in on tops of ridges, and when the Allies fought their way up, the Germans would simply retreat and then dig in on the next ridge, and the Allies would have to fight their way up again. Well, in Normandy, the hedgerows served that same kind of function. The Germans would kind of dig in and defend the hedgerows of one section of field. And then as the Allies approached and were ready to overwhelm them, they would retreat and they would dig in and defend the next section. So it was very, very slow and arduous fighting through what was called the hedgerow country. And the Allied soldiers actually suffered much more in the way of casualties fighting through these hedgerows as the Germans defended them than they did even during the landings on the beaches. But over a period of about 6 weeks, slowly, brutally slowly, with lots of casualties, the Allies did eventually drive the Germans out of northern France. And by the end of July, the Germans had retreated out of northern France, and the city of Paris was liberated. American troops, British troops, and free French troops who were now returning to France after having been driven out way back in the spring of 1940, now entered the city of Paris, which erupted in joy. A huge, the war almost took a break for a day. Or even a couple of days, as the people of Paris celebrated being free again after 4 years of living under the control of the Nazis. And so this was a sign for many that the war was coming to an end. Of course, it hadn't ended yet. And in fact, there was a whole fall and winter of desperate fighting still to come for the Allied soldiers on the Western Front. And now Allied troops began to move out of France. After liberating Paris, Allied troops began to move out of France and into Germany and into other territories that had been occupied by the Germans. British troops made a sharp left turn out of Normandy and headed up the coast through Belgium and then the Netherlands, and then they would eventually enter into Germany itself. American troops headed out across the French countryside and directly into Germany itself. And at that point, Adolf Hitler did something that was quite unexpected. And he did it probably because it was unexpected. And he anticipated that doing something unexpected might have the best chance of success. In December of 1944, as Allied forces were moving into Germany, both British and American, he launched a counterattack. That was called the Ardennes Offensive. The Ardennes Offensive, because it took place here in what's called the Ardennes Forest. This is not to be confused with the Argonne Forest. The Argonne Forest is here in France, and that was where the last successful Allied offensive took place in World War I, the one that finally brought an end to the war. This is the Ardennes Offensive and the Ardennes Forest, which is in southern Belgium. And basically, Hitler's plan was to suddenly and unexpectedly counterattack the Allies in an effort to drive a wedge between the British armies moving up the coast and the American armies moving out across the countryside. And what his hope was that by driving this wedge between them, the German army could then fight each of them and defeat each of them sort of separately from each other. And then perhaps that was the main goal here then, was for the German army to turn north, defeat the British, and capture the port of Antwerp, which was the new port where Allied forces were pouring in their supplies. At some point, the Allied forces had moved far enough away from Normandy, and they had actually captured a real port, Antwerp, and Hitler wanted to take this port from them so that it would be more difficult for them to supply their armies. But you get the idea. It was a surprise attack. The Germans had been retreating and retreating and retreating all summer and all fall. And for the Germans now to suddenly turn around and launch a major offensive, a major counterattack, was something the Allies did not expect. And it would happen in the wintertime, which was another thing that was not common in those times. And then to add extra punch to this counterattack, Adolf Hitler threw in all of what were called his reserve soldiers. So reserve soldiers are the soldiers who you hold back. You hold them in reserve. And basically their purpose is to defend the homeland against invasion. And Adolf Hitler decided to throw his reserve soldiers into this attack to try to give it extra punch. Um, and this is quite a gamble because if it doesn't work, then you do not have any reserve soldiers held back to defend Germany against the invading forces of the British, the Americans, and don't forget the Soviets out there in the East. So it was a big gamble by Adolf Hitler. And at least in the very, very, very short term, it did pay off. The Allies were caught by surprise. The German attack through the Ardennes forest was a shock, and it did come with enough ferocity and force that it drove the American soldiers. It hit the American sector first, and it did drive American soldiers back and back and back. Thousands of Americans were taken prisoner. Thousands of American soldiers were taken prisoner in the first couple weeks of the Ardennes offensive, while the American army kind of reeled, and having been surprised, basically been totally surprised by this attack. And so the sort of a bulge developed as the Germans forced their way through the American lines. A sort of a bulge developed in the Allied lines, and so the battle to sort of push back that bulge and to sort of regain for the Allies to regain their footing and get back to the business of pushing the Germans back became known as the Battle of the Bulge, because the Germans, through this shock surprise attack, had forced this kind of bulge, had created a bulge in the Allied lines. However, American forces did recover. They did recover. They did regroup, and they managed to stop the advance of the Germans and slowly begin to push back that bulge. And soon, American forces had completely defeated the German attack, had sort of absorbed this punch, and began to push back that bulge and flatten it out. And by the middle of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. It had been actually the costliest battle of the war for the United States. 30,000 American soldiers were killed. Almost 10% of all American soldiers killed during the Second World War died fighting the Battle of the Bulge. So Hitler had achieved a short-term gain by throwing his reserves into the battle. He did succeed in sort of catching the Allies off guard and driving them backward. But in the end, the overall plan failed. The American soldiers regrouped and came back at the Germans and defeated them. And now Hitler was really in trouble because, again, he had taken a gamble. He had dumped all of his reserve soldiers into this attack. The attack had now ultimately failed, and now there was really no one left to defend the German homeland except young boys, your age, really. You're going to see that in the last few months of the war, Hitler is arming boys who are aged 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and he's arming old men, men who had been too old to join the army, so men who are in their 50s and 60s. So now we move down to the bottom of page 21. So now, as I said, there was really no one left to defend Germany. Hitler had spent all of his reserve soldiers trying to win the Ardennes offensive or the Battle of the Bulge, and they had failed. And the German army now began to collapse. I mean, what was left of the German army retreated back into Germany, but they were in a state of total demoralization as the Allies pushed in from both directions, the Americans and British from the west, the Soviets moving in from the east. As I mentioned, Hitler now pulled boys your age and old men into the fight, but they weren't prepped to fight soldiers who were battle-tested soldiers who had been fighting for months, and in some cases, particularly in the case of Soviet soldiers, years against much more hardened German troops. So thousands of German soldiers began to surrender. A lot of them fled to the west. A lot of the soldiers who were fighting on the Eastern Front fled to the Western Front because they preferred to give themselves up to the Americans and the British. They did not know what their fate would be if they surrendered to the Russians. There were rumors, which proved to be true, that if you were captured by the Russians, you might be tortured and killed. Americans and British would treat you sort of humanely. The American and British move into Germany stopped at a river called the Elbe River, the Elbe. We had agreed with the Soviets that the Soviets would be allowed to take Berlin. American and British forces might have been able to get there faster, but the Soviets, having really done the bulk of the fighting against the Germans, sort of requested that they be allowed the honor of capturing the city of Berlin. They might, in the end, have preferred it not to take that honor for themselves, perhaps to share it, because the fighting around Berlin was extremely desperate. The Germans were now at the end, and they were fighting their most desperate defense of their capital, because they knew that when Berlin fell, the war would be over. But by agreement, the American and British forces stopped at the Elbe River. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin and then pressed through to the Elbe. And what you're seeing here is a famous photograph where American soldiers from one end of the Elbe met up on the ruins of a bridge with Soviet soldiers coming in from the eastern side. But now the battle for Berlin was underway, and you can see this is one of the last photos of Adolf Hitler. He's speaking to a group of his troops. This is what was left to defend the city of Berlin against the Soviet army. These are boys your age. We're talking about, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, who were left to defend the city. And the fight was actually a very desperate fight, and it cost the battles around Berlin cost the Soviets 350,000 additional casualties. In the meantime, 600,000 Germans died defending Berlin. But finally, Soviet troops defeated them and entered into the city. Adolf Hitler had been riding out the battle in an underground bunker, along with the leaders of the Nazi Party and the German military high command. As Soviet forces neared the bunker, Adolf Hitler scrawled out one final rant against the Jews. He refused really to accept responsibility for Germany's defeat. He cried out in this rant that his generals had failed him, had betrayed him. It was almost a repeat of that stab in the back myth that he had perpetrated with the German people about World War I. He essentially said that Germany's best generals had failed and had betrayed him and turned against him. Actually, this was partially true. Some of the German generals had made an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler previously in the war that had obviously failed. But the reality of Hitler blaming Germany's defeat on the Jews and on Germany's generals was just asinine. Hitler had made so many strategic errors, and he had failed to listen to the advice of his generals so many times, advice which might have given Germany a fighting chance in this war. And finally, Adolf Hitler and his wife committed suicide. And once that happened, once Hitler was gone, that now gave the German military commanders the freedom to seek out a ceasefire and bring an end to the war. And that ceasefire was achieved on May 8th, 1945. On May 8th, 1945, an agreement was reached between the German military commanders and the Allied military commanders to bring an end to the hostilities in Europe. And if the day of the liberation of Paris was a day of great jubilation, what was now known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945, May 9th on the Eastern Front, became a day of wild celebration in all of the Allied countries. The war in Europe was over. And so what you're seeing here are, on the upper left-hand corner, the crowds gathering in Times Square in New York City. Down below, the crowds gathering outside 10 Downing Street, where Winston Churchill spoke to them one more time. And then finally, the crowds gathering in Red Square in Moscow to celebrate the defeat of Germany VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th or 9th on the Eastern Front, 1945. But of course, that celebration had to be a little bit tempered because although Germany had been defeated, the war was still going on in the Pacific. And what that meant was that so many of those soldiers who had been fighting against the Germans anticipated that soon they would be transferred to the Pacific to finish the war against the Japanese. And so, section number 15, Allied offensives in the Pacific. I hope that you'll be able to explain why naval and air campaigns by the United States were the most important military contributions to the victory over Japan. So remember that the Allied strategy had been to beat Germany first. Germany was considered the more immediate threat to the Allies, and so the strategy was to focus the resources of the Allied countries on defeating the Germans while sort of holding the Japanese at arm's length in the Pacific. And then once victory over Germany was assured, maybe not completed, but assured, then starting to transfer resources back to the Pacific to begin the process of defeating the Japanese. And now that process was underway. So we're at the top of page 22. So for the Americans, the strategy for fighting the Japanese was this. If it was necessary to go and recapture every island and every territory that the Japanese had captured in those first 6 months of the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the war would have dragged on for years and years and years and been extremely costly to the Allied powers. The United States was doing the bulk of the fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific. We had the support of the British, but that support didn't become really, really significant until quite late in the war. The Soviet Union was not in the war against the Japanese until literally the last days of the war. So the Americans were going to carry the bulk of the burden of defeating the Japanese. And the American commanders, Admiral Nimitz, he conceived of a strategy that said, look, we do not need to recapture every territory that the Germans captured in the first 6 months of the war. All we need to do is we need to capture the territories, capture the islands, which are essential to the end game, which is an invasion of Japan itself. So we need to capture the islands that will be stepping stones toward the invasion of Japan. And all the other islands, we skip over those, because if we successfully invade Japan and defeat capture the Japanese government, then the support for the Japanese soldiers out on all those islands will dry up. And almost like grapes on a grapevine, when you cut the main stem, they will not get water anymore, right? They won't get supplies anymore, and they'll wither up and they'll die, and they'll have to surrender. So this strategy became known as island hopping, sometimes called leapfrogging. We're going to call it island hopping, because the idea was that the Americans would hop from island to island, skipping over the ones that were not essential to the invasion of Japan, and attacking and capturing only the ones that were essential to the invasion of Japan. And what would determine the essentialness of an island? Well, the key was we wanted the islands that could be converted into air bases, because much like Adolf Hitler wanting to strategically do a campaign of strategic bombing against Britain before invading Britain, of course, remember that didn't work out for him. The Americans understood that we needed to begin a campaign of strategic bombing against Japan in anticipation of an invasion of Japan, that we needed to destroy Japan's factories, warehouses, railroads, everything that the Japanese needed to continue to produce war materials. Because if we destroyed Japan's ability to supply its army, then that would really be helpful in the invasion of Japan. It would open up the door to making the invasion of Japan possible. And of course, every Japanese factory that is destroyed, every Japanese port that is wiped out, would make it that much harder for Japan to continue to supply their armies in China and in the other islands. And again, it's that whole strategy of of sort of drying up their supplies so that those soldiers would no longer be able to carry out the war. So the Americans were really focusing on islands that could be converted into air bases. And particularly for this plane that you see here, flying out of one of these new, actually, it looks like this one might be landing at one of the new American air bases in what was called the Marianas Islands. So the Marianas Islands are located here. And so islands, you don't need to know the names of them, but just to give you an idea, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. These were islands that were converted into bases for this new American plane called the B-29 Super Fortress. The B-29 Super Fortress was a very special aircraft. It was developed by the Boeing Aircraft Corporation specifically for fighting in the Pacific theater. Because the Pacific is a area of vast spaces. I mean, the entire continent of Europe could fit into that space, basically, which the Japanese had captured in the first 6 weeks of the war. The Pacific is huge, vast space in between, say, the place where a plane is going to take off and the target which it's going to bomb. So the B-29 Super Fortress was designed to operate in the Pacific. Notice, four engines, huge fuel tanks, so that the operational range of the B-29 Super Fortress was over 3,000 miles. That is to say that a B-29 with a full load of bombs could fly out 3,000 miles, drop its bombs, and then fly back 3,000 miles. That was the kind of range that was needed to operate in the Pacific. Now, of course, this plane would far outfly its fighter escorts. There were no fighters that could follow it that far, and until the American Navy had penetrated closer to Japan, you couldn't use carrier-based fighters to escort them either. So this plane was developed with a pressurized cabin. In other words, when an airplane gets high enough altitude, the air pressure is no longer sufficient to allow people to breathe. You know that when you fly a commercial jet, there's what's called a pressurized cabin. There's artificial air pressure to help you breathe. This airplane was the first one ever with a pressurized cabin so that the crew could breathe even as the plane climbed to higher altitudes. And that was the way that the plane would defend itself against Japanese fighter planes trying to shoot it down. It could climb to an altitude that the Japanese fighter planes could not climb to because the B-29 had a pressurized cabin and the Japanese fighter planes didn't. Now, unfortunately for B-29 crews, they would have to come down to lower altitudes to actually drop their bombs in order to accurately drop them and hit their targets. And so when the B-29 had to come down to those lower altitudes to drop its bombs, it was much more vulnerable to being shot down still stuck on the Germans, by Japanese fighters. And so, especially at the beginning, before American carriers could get close enough to launch American fighter planes to protect them, the B-29 crews were very much at risk. And kind of like the strategic bomber crews in Europe, they suffered very high casualties. Nevertheless, the B-29 could unload an unprecedented bomb load. And starting in really in the spring of 1944, the Americans began a massive strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Again, to weaken Japan prior to an American invasion, an Allied invasion. British troops would also take part. The other thing that the Americans, the Allies, experienced was the closer you got to Japan, the more intense and more sort of radical the Japanese efforts to defend themselves became. In the Japanese military, there is a culture that says that the worst possible thing is to surrender. Surrender is the most dishonorable thing you can do. It is honorable to die in the defense of the emperor and in the defense of the Japanese homeland, but it is not honorable to surrender. And so, as the Americans fought their way through this island hopping campaign, the closer they got to Japan, the more intense the fighting was. On one of those islands I mentioned, I believe it was Saipan, 20,000 Japanese soldiers were killed fighting the Americans, and only 1,000 Japanese surrendered. And those who surrendered were surrendered really only because they were too badly wounded to fight. The Japanese basically fought to the death. And now, as American and Allied ships got closer and closer to Japan, an even more radical form of defense began to be seen. And these were called kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze pilots were Japanese pilots who loaded their airplanes with explosives and basically dove their airplanes directly onto Allied ships in what was a suicide attack. These Japanese pilots intentionally committed suicide, diving their planes directly onto Allied ships because, of course, um, you could do a lot more damage if an entire plane loaded with bombs struck an Allied ship. It could do a lot more damage than one bomb being dropped from a plane. Um, and I suppose there was a better chance of actually hitting your target if you piloted your plane directly into an Allied ship. And so the closer the Allies got to Japan, the more and more of these kamikaze attacks they endured. And what is amazing is that so many kamikaze planes were actually shot down by Allied gunners. You can see Allied gunners on this ship trying to shoot down this Japanese kamikaze plane as it approaches the ship. Um, it's believed that only about 1 out of every 5 kamikaze pilots actually hit their target. And it's estimated that 4,000 kamikaze pilots were killed or actually hit their targets during the war, which suggests that 20,000 kamikaze pilots killed themselves during the war trying to strike Allied ships. 4,000 of them actually hit their targets, and they destroyed 60 Allied ships, really all during the last few months of the war. So this was a sign to the Allies of just how difficult it was going to be to invade Japan. The closer you got to Japan itself, the more intensely the Japanese defended and the more radical their defense of Japan was, fighting to the last, dying rather than surrendering. This is what the Allies could expect from an invasion of Japan. So let's move to the bottom of page 22 now. Now, given these facts, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, was looking for a way to end the war, if possible, without an invasion of Japan. Now, remember that prior to this time, the President of the United States had been Franklin D. Roosevelt. But President Roosevelt had died in April of 1945, less than a month before the defeat of Germany. So President Roosevelt, who had seen the United States through the entire war, died about a month before Germany's defeat. His vice president, Harry Truman, then took over as President of the United States. And what was being presented to him was the information that an invasion of Japan would cost the United States around 500,000 dead and 1 million total casualties. So probably 500,000 American soldiers killed and 500,000 wounded in an invasion of Japan. They anticipated that the Japanese toll would be even greater. We, the United States, were estimating 2 million Japanese casualties in an invasion of Japan. And what's astonishing is that the Japanese military estimated 10 million Japanese casualties in the event of an Allied invasion of Japan. And so the prospect of an Allied invasion was a really a very grim one. It was believed that that was the only way to end the war, was to invade Japan. But 500,000 American dead, that was more Americans than had died in the entire war up to that point. An invasion of Japan, it seemed, would double the total Allied casualties of the entire war. And so President Truman was hoping for a way to avoid having to invade Japan. In the meantime, a top secret project was underway to build what was called an atomic bomb. So an atomic bomb explodes with the force that is released when you split atoms. So atoms are held together by powerful forces. But if you can split those atoms, those forces are released. And so the way that an atomic bomb essentially works is you have a core of a very dense radioactive element like uranium. And you introduce what's called a neutron, which is a part of an atom, and you sort of fire a neutron into that core, and that neutron splits the nucleus of one of the atoms, which releases energy and more neutrons. And then those neutrons split the nuclei of other atoms, which releases more neutrons and more energy, and it starts what's called a chain reaction. And when this chain reaction is allowed to go on uncontrolled, it basically converts the entire mass of that core of uranium into energy. And so all of the energy that bonds as those atoms are split and as the core breaks down, all of those bonds holding together those atoms, all those powerful bonds are released, and all of the energy that holds them together are released in one massive explosion. That's how an atomic bomb works. And for 3 years, the United States had, in its most top secret operation, which is called the Manhattan Project, the United States had been working to develop an atomic bomb. It was so top secret that even as vice president, Harry Truman didn't know about it. He did not learn about the Manhattan Project until after he became president. And in the summer of 1945, the scientists and engineers who'd been working on the Manhattan Project informed President Truman that they believed they had 3 working atomic bombs. And President Truman insisted that the first atomic bomb be a test detonation. And so in July of 1945, the first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert at a site called Trinity. And when it exploded with a force of 30,000 pounds, 30,000 pounds, 30,000 tons of dynamite. So imagine 30,000 tons of dynamite all exploding at once. It was detonated in the desert. There were sensors nearby to measure temperature. Before these sensors were destroyed, they registered temperatures greater than that of the surface of the sun. You get the idea. The atomic bomb exploded with enormous force. And so the question was, could we get Japan to surrender simply by threatening to use the atomic bomb? And that brings us to the top of page 23. The Allied bombing campaign in Japan had already flattened several major Japanese cities. The city of Tokyo, the capital, had been utterly destroyed by the B-29s that had been bombing that city, using both what are called percussion bombs, which destroy buildings by blasting them apart through the force of their explosion, and using incendiary bombs as well, which are bombs that ignite fires. So basically, the Japanese capital, Tokyo, had already been wiped out, and several other major Japanese cities had as well. And over 200,000 Japanese civilians had already been killed as a result of this Allied strategic bombing campaign. And yet the Japanese had not yet surrendered. The United States made a final attempt to get the Japanese to surrender. Now, the Allies demanded what's called unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender means that you must agree to surrender and understand that we're not promising anything. There are no terms of surrender. Oftentimes, when a country is desperate to end a war, they will offer to negotiate a surrender with the country that they're fighting. And the country that is surrendering will say, okay, we will surrender if you will let us do this and this and this and this. And if the country that is winning is desperate to bring a conclusion to the war, oftentimes they will agree to those terms. But the Allies had demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. There will be no terms. And for the Japanese, that was sort of unacceptable. At the very least, they wanted a guarantee that the emperor would continue to be the ruler of Japan. The Allies weren't prepared to make that guarantee. And so the Allies and the Japanese found themselves at a stalemate in terms of negotiations. And so, faced with the prospect of an American invasion that would cost us 1 million casualties, 500,000 killed, 500,000 wounded, President Truman instead decided to use the atomic bomb to try to force the Japanese to surrender. The first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. A single B-29 carried it over the city and dropped it. And when it exploded, it instantly killed 80,000 people and wiped out, as you can see, really the entire core of the city. Um, it was a shocking amount of destruction. No one knew. I mean, the bomb had been tested in the desert. No one knew what would happen if you actually used it against the structures of a city. But it completely, in one giant fireball and one massive explosion, leveled basically the entire city of Hiroshima. And as I said, killed 80,000 people instantly. And it's believed that over the course of the next few years, perhaps an additional 100,000 died of their wounds suffered, or died from mutations from the radiation that they experienced when this radioactive device exploded. And yet, Japan still did not surrender. Japanese military told the Emperor Hirohito that they had it on that they had information that the United States only had one such bomb, and so the Japanese did not surrender. Thus, 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, again largely flattening that city as well, and killing an additional 60,000 people instantly. And at that point, the Japanese military really had discredited themselves completely. Um, they had they had taken Japan into a war which now they were clearly going to lose. And furthermore, they had given false information, incorrect information to the emperor. And remember that by now, Emperor Hirohito was no longer a 26-year-old youngster, as he was in 1926. This is now 20 years later. You know, he was in his 40s, he was in his mid 40s, and he was no longer in a position where he felt like he had to defer to these older military men. And now that the military had discredited themselves by dragging Japan into a war that they were clearly going to lose, and they had further discredited themselves by giving him false information about the atomic bomb, resulting in the destruction of another Japanese city and the death of another 60,000 Japanese civilians, the emperor was now in a position to assert himself. And he now told the military leaders, it's over. And he ordered Japan to surrender. It took some time for American troops to enter Japan, but the emperor broadcast a message to his people. It was the first time they had ever heard his voice. Hirohito broadcast a message to his people, ordering them not to resist the invasion of the Allied forces. And so, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan's surrender was officially carried out on the decks of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. This you can see the Japanese military. Many of the Japanese military leaders committed suicide rather than surrender, but those who remained signed the surrender papers on board the decks of the battleship Missouri, September 2nd, 1945. So VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, is celebrated September 2nd. And here you see again a truly wild celebration in Times Square once again, because now the war was completely over. Germany had been defeated in the spring, Japan now defeated in the late summer of 1945, and the Second World War had come to an end. So that does not quite bring an end to our unit. We will have 2 more lessons on the Holocaust, because the true horrors of the Holocaust were discovered in the last year of the war. So we'll take a few lessons now to discuss the Holocaust. But until then, take care of yourselves, stay healthy and safe. Take care, Modern World History students. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.